welcome again. My name is Brian Spack. I'm the Director of Energy System Transition at Energy Consumers Australia. Many of you may know me from my previous role at CSIRO. I happily joined ECA last week. I'll be serving in two roles today. So I'm the MC for our session, and I'm also one of the speakers. So I hope you don't get too tired of my voice or trying to adjust for the accent. So I want to begin by acknowledging the Awabakal people, who are the traditional custodians of the city of Newcastle, where I am today. ECA acknowledges the fact that we are all, wherever we are in Australia, on Aboriginal land. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So before I jump into some logistics and housekeeping, I want to focus your attention on the next slide and the amazing opportunity that we are all part of as interested participants in Australia's evolving energy industry. So as you may know, Australia leads the world in renewable adoption and on the household adoption of rooftop solar. It's an amazing opportunity. So this is, it's not a problem to manage. It's not a minimum demand boogeyman, which isn't to dismiss the real system security issues that can result from an inability to plan for and design a system for what customers want and are investing in, which is solar on their roofs, among other things. So what do we need to do to seize this opportunity? Well, that's what our speakers are going to address today. Before they do, I'm just going to run through a couple of housekeeping issues. So quick reminder that the optimal experience for this is the Zoom app. So you can download that through an email that you should have gotten about an hour ago. If you're having trouble with the technology, I can't help you, but someone in the chat function might be able to. So just drop any concerns you have in there. So this is the third of 3 webinars focused on framing the future by learning from the shocks of 2020. So the previous themes were on responding. We're focused on responding to COVID and the bushfires. The shock we're focused on today, thankfully, is not one of global calamity, but from my perspective, one of tremendous excitement and opportunity. The shock is the gradual but clear and undeniable role of consumers in the electricity system. How do we design that system so that it's future and consumer focused? Rather than reacting to consumer demands by centrally curtailing solar, how do we forecast and design for the system that consumers want and are in fact investing in? So we've got a great panel today. I'm joined, after I speak, you'll hear thoughts from Dr. Andrew Nance and the inimitable Mark Byrne from the Total Environment Center. Mark's got a rough internet connection, so to mitigate for any issues, he's pre-taped his remarks. And then after relatively brief remarks from the 3 of us, ECA's CEO, Lynn Gallagher, will join and guide a discussion, including audience Q&A. So we'd ask that you'd post your questions in the Q&A thread. There's a button at the bottom of the screen, but you can also use the chat screen for any observations or comments you've got. So to get you started thinking, we've got a focusing question for today. So we'd like you to keep this question: how do we better incorporate consumers' values, needs, and expectations into energy system design and planning? So we'll be tweeting about today's event. You can join in if that's your thing. Use the hashtag TakeCharge21. All the social media accounts will be active, and so we also encourage you to follow ECA's social media accounts and sign up for our monthly newsletter if you'd like to keep in touch that way. All right, well let's jump into it. So a few more moments for me. So I really want to do a couple things in what hopefully is a pretty brief chat for me about system design and framing the future. So the first is to talk about the system holistically and how we can think, just sort of system design principles and thinking more systematically about the energy system, not and not just isolated to electricity. And then secondly, I want to provide an example of some practical tools from overseas that might be useful here. So the next screen, you'll see a tweet from Amory Lovins, who I've called the Godfather. If you don't know Amory, you should. I've called him the Godfather because he knows, or he's forgotten more about a decentralized energy system than most of us probably know. He's been thinking and writing about it since the 1970s. I'd specifically recommend that there's a book he wrote called Small is Profitable, which is almost at its 20th anniversary. And it begins with a pretty concise list of 207 ways in which small scale resources have intrinsic value relative to their larger scale cousins in the energy system. So Amory's a great guy. He's got lots of interesting quotes of his own. But here he quotes Dwight D. Eisenhower by saying that if a problem can't be solved, enlarge it. And what he's really talking about is that if, when sometimes we break problems down into smaller components because they're easier to solve. It's what you learn in math kind of growing up. But oftentimes, if you make a problem bigger, it unlocks opportunities for synergy. So how can we think about that in the context of an excess of rooftop solar? So on the next slide, another American, Matt Eggers, in another tweet, asked about some wild future in which power will be virtually free. Well, welcome, Matt, to the future to the future in Australia. That's the situation we find ourselves in at certain times of the day in the year. So, are there opportunities for us to do crazy stuff with really cheap energy, so cheap that we're pretty much willing to throw it away? So I've got an idea. It's not too crazy. You've probably heard it before. But before I share it, I guess I want to go back in history a bit. And so you might be familiar, you might have seen these images before. They're from Fifth Avenue in New York. That's a street none other than Donald Trump made famous by saying he could shoot someone on it and still be elected president. Regardless, more than 100 years ago, on Easter morning, 1900, on the left side of this, you've got to squint really hard to find any automobiles. There's one, and hopefully it's been circled in red. So everything else there is a horse and buggy, and there's only one vehicle. Fast forward 13 years later, photography has improved, or at least the focus of the photographer has. But the other thing that's changed, probably more dramatically, is you've got to squint to find a horse and buggy. Everything on Fifth Avenue on Easter morning in 1913, every vehicle is an automobile. So I think you might know where I'm going, but there's a related revolution happening today. Of course, it's electric vehicles. So I don't want to dwell on this too long, but I've got two charts on the screen. On the left side, what you see is global EV sales. And there's a clear trend, and it's going up and up very quickly. On the right side, we've got the volume weighted average, the price of battery packs and cells, which are the most expensive and meaningful component of electric vehicles. And those costs are dropping significantly. So these are all historic numbers that I'm showing, although there's a forecast for sales for this calendar year. Most industry analysts expect battery costs to drop another 50% over the next 5 years. And so that's what you see here when there's increasing sales and dropping costs. That's a good reinforcing cycle that's going to continue, and it's going to fundamentally transform the automobile industry. So as you probably know, Norway is the global leader in electric vehicle sales, and I anticipate that we'll all be Norway soon. And just in last calendar year 2020, 54% of total vehicle sales in Norway were plug-in electrics. All estimates are that Norway will destroy that record this year. They're on track for at least 60%, if not 70% of all vehicles being sold being plug-in electrics this year. So the idea that I'm proposing here is really that the challenge of excess solar can be resolved with the advent of a large number of electric vehicles. If they're anything like today's cars, they'll be parked the vast majority of the time. They're just sitting there well more than 90% of the time. And so if they're available simply to be charged during the day, the quote unquote problem of excess solar can be solved to the benefit of Australia's energy consumers. So it's not to say that this is an easy solution. Cars aren't there to support the grid. They're there to get people from one place to another. So if they are helping the grid, we need to make sure that they do so in a way that doesn't do it at the expense of customers getting where they need to go. So we need to design flexible charging and charging stations in a way that consumers find valuable and inherently better than the status quo. But we can do it and have really a wonderful, exciting future where transport isn't just clean, it's massively cheaper because we charge our vehicles when energy is essentially free. So before I pass to Mark, or a recorded version of him, I wanted to introduce one other concept that is perhaps a bit more practical and focused. And it's really a framework for integrating distribution planning within kind of large-scale transmission planning, something like the ISP. So the diagram on the screen is from a document that came out of the US Department of Energy that talks about integrated distribution planning. So we're familiar with integrated system planning, which Andrew will talk about in a bit, and is the type of system-wide planning that IEMO provides. But there is distribution planning that occurs among all of Australia's distribution network service providers. But there are a number of tools, many of which are described on this in this diagram, that can make distribution planning a lot more informative, effective, and help us prepare for and plan for a future in which we're leveraging electric vehicles and not just seeing them as another problem to solve, but just like solar can be an opportunity that we want to seize. So one of the things that I think is somewhat remarkable about this graph or this diagram in this study is really that it came out of Minnesota. If you know anything about Minnesota, it's the United States answer for Canada. It's very cold, wintry. It's a place where solar is unlikely to ever be nearly as valuable as it is here in Australia. And nevertheless, 5 years ago now, the Public Utility Commission there was really focused on being thoughtful about planning. So really in Australia today, we're in an interesting place where we're having to be revolutionary in the way we operate the grid. But and that's not going to change because of how far ahead we are of the rest of the world. But there's a lot we can learn from overseas, and I might specifically point to some American examples here about how to better plan, to take advantage of some of the existing tools to better plan the grid, so that we can design a system that meets consumers' needs, values, and expectations. All right, so with that, I'll pass to Mark.
Hi. I'm sure you've all heard the old joke about the Irishman who gets asked the way to a certain town. Let's call it Tipperary. To be sure I do, he says, but I wouldn't start from here. To my mind, it's much the same with the electricity system. If you were designing it from the ground up now, you wouldn't have most energy traveling hundreds of kilometers from where it's made to where it's used. Not when you can make it in your own backyard, so to speak. It's like food, local is best. Decentralisation is the second pillar of the energy transition, alongside decarbonisation. Fortunately, they support each other. It would be a different story if, for instance, you could build a coal or nuclear power station in your backyard. We're rapidly moving into a world in which energy flows are not just one directional or even bidirectional, but multi-directional. And lots of those flows will be over very small distances. But the rules are still largely stuck in the old world of one-way flows. That's because we've yet to get our heads around the potentially radical implications of the paradigm shift from top-down to bottom-up thinking. What I like to call the democratic grid model flips the old supply chain model upside down. instead of on-site or local energy being a niche product on the fringes of centralised supply. The main role of the bulk system is to provide backup for when your energy needs can't be met on-site or in the local system. The democratic grid model is based partly on what's called the layered decentralised optimisation model that has emerged from the US over the past decade. It's also based on the emerging discourses of energy democracy or energy sovereignty. I could give you an academic definition, but essentially it's all about agency, about people and communities having the power to make decisions about their energy system. Put these two discourses together and this is what you get. This is my working definition of a democratic grid. Or how about the following quote, which comes from a promotional video from the peer-to-peer platform provider, Enosi. To date, energy democracy has manifested mostly in the boom in rooftop solar. We know from numerous surveys that having more control or autonomy is the second biggest reason why people invest in rooftop solar, after the desire to save money, but for better or worse, before the desire to save the planet. As we've seen recently, when there's even the hint of a reduction in this autonomy or this income stream, some people will get pretty angry. It's not hard to see why. Our energy supply is something we can now have more control over in a world that seems increasingly out of control. And the boom in rooftop solar has been a shining light in the darkness of Australia's climate and energy policy morass over the past 2 decades. How people and communities respond to the democratisation of energy will depend not only on their own resources and ingenuity, but also on the model of the grid we choose, either deliberately or accidentally. It's early days and there are lots of challenges. Here are some of them, and I'll pause to give you time to read this. And there is a shadow hanging over this vision. In the future, our electricity supply is likely to be even more important than it is now, thanks to the electrification of everything, especially transport. But it could also be more fragile as we face more frequent and intense severe weather events, bushfires and floods, storms and cyclones, heat waves and droughts. Here too, local energy can help. Shortening the supply chain reduces the risk of interruptions, although it can also be useful to have access to the main grid for backup supply. This doesn't mean we need to incentivise networks to indulge in new rounds of potential gold plating as they roll out more standalone systems and microgrids in high-risk areas. It could also mean simpler solutions like incentivising solar owners to make sure their systems are islandable in the case of blackouts, or making sure that EVs with vehicle-to-grid capability can be harnessed to supply essential loads, even for a few hours. The technical solutions are evolving, but really they're not rocket surgery. The bigger question is, what kind of political and regulatory changes do we need to make to ensure that communities, as well as individual households and businesses, can work together on local energy solutions? Rather than supplying ready-made answers, it's probably more important at this stage to have access to good decision-making tools. So I commend to you Our Power, a vision for clean, affordable, dependable energy for all. It has been developed by ECA, ACOS and TEC and was formerly called the New Energy Compact. Many of you were involved in shaping it. Our Power is not just a utopian vision, it's a set of principles for engaging with the energy transition which were developed with extensive public input. It also lays out a simple methodology for co-designing successful policy reforms. That's the one on the right-hand side of the screen. And it will be a living document. The launch is in early October, and I hope to see you there. Meanwhile, I'd like to leave you with what I see as the 3 fundamental principles of the democratic grid. Think local, do no harm, and listen to the people. But this is just my view, and hopefully you'll get to have your say in the coming months and years. Thank you.
Okay, hi all. My name's Andrew Nance, and I chair the Integrated System Plan Consumer Panel. Can we have the next slide, please, Kira? So I thought I'd start with a little bit of history. I'm going to try and give a very simple presentation today, so let's see how we go. So various approaches to state-run electricity systems appeared over the 20th century. So there was no real electricity or shared electricity to talk about in the 19th century. So 20th century, we did that. National electricity market kicks off in 1998. So we're just at the turn of the century there, we decided that we'd be better off if we shared a bit more. 2001, mandatory renewable energy target kicks off. We start to see the emergence of a few projects around the place. Jurisdictions introduce feed-in tariffs for rooftop solar around 2008, so what, 13 years ago. Across the 2010s, the cost of solar and wind energy falls a lot, and a lot gets connected. And then September 2016, so we're coming up to our 5th anniversary. And so for those of you that don't know me, I'm coming to you from sunny Adelaide, the traditional lands of the Kaurna people. And it's 5 years ago, and it's still fresh in certainly my memory as an energy nerd. Statewide power outage, September 2016, the sudden outbreak of blame and opinion, and we end up with what was known as the Finkel Review. And so the Integrated System Plan, or the ISP, was created from one of the, or 3 of the recommendations from the Finkel Review for what they were calling an integrated grid plan. And that was July 2017. So next slide, please, Kira. So the system planning, and I guess that's really what I'm here to make a bit of a contribution to this discussion on. So the Integrated System Plan, it's updated every 2 years by AEMO and recommends what's known as the optimal development path and a series of actionable projects. And in the 2020 ISP, the most recent one, these were worth tens of billions over the next few years in mainly network investments. So because the ISP has taken on this more formal role in triggering investments, a consumer panel was appointed in roughly November last year, of which I am one member, and there are 4 others. There's 5 of us all up, and there's more information on us on the AEMO website, which is of course very, very easy to navigate, but I'll come back to that later. And our role is to promote the consumer interest in the Integrated System Plan. So it's a highly complex, very technical, and very difficult to engage with for a lot of folks. So our view, I guess, is to taking a more systemic approach to what this is, rather than saying we know what a good plan is or should be. Is that we believe that the consumer interest is most likely to be met if AEMO and its consultants and advisors continuously improve the accuracy of the forecasts. So we need to get better at predicting the future, I guess, which is always going to be difficult. We need to be really clear, I guess, in terms of managing uncertainty and how we do that. If we're going to develop a power system that is robust to really a range of possible futures, we don't know how things are going to turn out. We need to accept the fact that we don't, and we need to try and plan accordingly. We then also, and this probably needs to come first and ties everything together, and it's to capture the benefits of good engagement. The process and system planning, it needs to inform consumers and other stakeholders on what the system plan means for them. So you need to take a NEM-wide plan to a local and sector-specific context so that local and domain expertise can be channeled back to each iteration of the plan. And I guess that's that. We're trying to set up a bit of a an ongoing process where that continuous feedback continuously improves the plan and it gets better over time. Next slide, please, Kira. So I guess the next question is, what are we actually planning for? And that's the difficult part, is we don't know how things are going to turn out. And we need to be able to deal with a range of not only destinations, but also, I guess, a pace of change. So the challenges are as much about deciding when stuff should be built as well as where, and then trying to join all that together, because of course, once you do one thing, it impacts on the need for another. So I guess scenario analysis and sensitivity testing of the different development paths and key inputs are the main ways that AEMO use to manage uncertainty. The importance of scenario analysis is maybe something we can come back to in the Q&A, but it's something that is a really important part of delivering on a plan like this, is to making sure that we understand the range of possible futures that might be out there. So the key forecasting challenge is understanding consumer demand in whether it's 2030, 2040 or beyond. These are the sort of infrastructure lives we're talking about. This is very much impacted by the uptake of customer-owned energy resources, aka distributed energy, DER, solar, batteries, EVs, and the electrification of everything. And I think this is a very key thing for us to be thinking about in terms of how we plan going forward. The electrification of everything. So everything always has a local context. So is it reasonable that a single whole of system plan, such as the ISP as it's conceived, can integrate what's happening at the local level? And I'm leaving that there as a question, and hopefully we can get some feedback. So, and in thinking about that, what happens when customer-owned energy dominates your local networks? Local system operators will need local system plans, and I think David Habbett's already alluded to this in the Q&A. So, and these will need to be consistent with the ISP and how AEMO operates the wholesale market and the transmission. So, I guess in the ideal consumer future, the bottom down and the top up meet somewhere neatly together. There's hardly any gaps, not much overlap. We haven't overspent, we haven't underspent, and we've got it all spot on. It's a challenge, and it's probably not going to happen if we only start at one end, which is probably what dominates at the moment. So, but this is my parting question: is this the electrification of everything, and whether that's transport or moving away from fossil gas? Is this our chance to pivot to a different approach? So we can say that, look, we've done things the way we've done them, and that's fine. It served a purpose, but looking forward, we've got a very different future ahead of us, and it's going to be very local, and we need to make to join the dots, and that's really the challenge. And I think that there's a different entry point for consumers in these discussions, and that's starting at the local end and working your way back in, because I think we've seen and demonstrated that trying to bring that local context into the ISP as it stands at the moment is very challenging and probably not all that effective. Anyway, that's my contribution. Really looking forward to hearing some questions and comments from here. Thank you.
Okay. Well, good morning, and we're just going to get all the panelists with video on and sound on. So Mark, do you want to put your video on?
Lynn, I'm getting a message that I can't start my video because the host has stopped it.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll get that sorted. Okay, I'll start speaking, and then Kira, if we can see if we can get Mark and Brian. There we go.
Come on.
Great, thanks. Welcome back. All right, so many of you, so welcome everybody to our third webinar in the series. As Brian pointed out at the beginning, it's the final one for this year. Many of you know me, but in case some of you don't, I'm Lynn Gallagher. I'm the CEO of Energy Consumers Australia. I guess what we want to do now is really have some discussion, and then we'll pick up some of the question threads. If I don't specifically ask your question, don't feel neglected. We'll try and synthesize some of them into some of the common threads. But also our practice is after each of these webinars to come back with a response. We'll seek some responses to some of those detailed questions if they don't get asked in the session. So don't feel that we're not going to take up some important points that you raise. I guess there's a couple of unifying things that I've heard across the three people who've spoken already this morning. I think importantly, it is always worthwhile remembering the journey of where we've been and how we got here. But this moment feels quite pivotal as an opportunity to do better. We've learned some things along the way about the importance of planning, of thinking about these bigger questions, that we can't assume the future is going to be exactly like the past. As Brian pointed out, the pace of change, and helpfully Heather Ransom-Cooper also referenced some information on other transitions in the chat, which is that the pace of change is always going to be faster than we currently anticipate. I guess there's also some key thoughts that come out from all speakers, which is really about what we've tended to do is define some of these transformational changes, particularly things driven by consumers, as problems to be solved, not opportunities for a better future system. And we need to recognise that power has shifted to consumers. With the opportunities, they will be the ones buying electric vehicles. They will be the ones making decisions about when and how they support the grid, and when and how they actually want to use their cars to get them from one place to the other versus providing grid stability. So there is a shift in power that we need to recognise, plan for, reward, integrate, not treat them as other. So I guess I'd like to sort of step off there and ask a question for the panelists to really make some comments about. Critical to success, I think, is knowing where you're headed and why you're headed there. So in fact, the future, as David Habiert's pointed out and Andrew's pointed out, there are a number of plausible scenarios, but I think you still need to have some kind of common sense of purpose. And as Daniel Westerman at AEMO has pointed out, it's going to take a village, if you like, or the community to have a collaboration, to have a discussion around these things. So with that sort of thought in mind as well, what would each of you think we need to do to develop that sort of shared sense of purpose about why, where we're headed and why we're headed there? So if I start with Mark, and then everyone else just jump in when you feel you want to make a comment.
Great, thanks, Lynn. Hi, everyone. You can hear me okay?
Yes, yes.
Great. I guess it starts with who we think about as we, and we clearly have a problem with the federal government being in denial around climate policy and climate change in general. So we have to kind of put them aside as kind of an anomaly and think of we, I suppose, as the energy sector and energy consumers or users. And I think there's a fair bit of consensus amongst those of us inside the sector that we want to achieve the energy trilemma. That's clean, affordable, reliable power. Although I think there's a fair bit of support for that vision in general terms amongst consumers, but I would question whether we need to rethink reliability and replace it with resilience. And I think we've just started to get our heads around what a resilient system might look like and how that's different to a reliable system. And I think we have a fair way to go with the market bodies in that respect. The AMC, in its Black System Review, said that DR could contribute to system resilience in the case of emergencies by switching off. And the AER thinks that the regulatory settings are okay as they are, even though it couldn't achieve an outcome with respect to widespread and long duration outages. And there's, the ESB couldn't factor in resilience in its DR work stream at all. After a year of pressure from me, there's just nothing that came out. So I think we still have a problem with resilience, but that's a kind of early conversation that's probably quite reasonable. Just two other comments with respect to the ISP. I think that's a kind of, as Andrew said, it's a fair indication of the top-down nature of much current planning. If we're looking at a system with potentially 50% of capacity being on site or in the local system by 2040 and perhaps earlier, then we need to plan we could plan quite differently. But the ISP is really not to my mind, not an integrated system plan. It's a kind of transmission planner's Christmas wish list that kind of ignores the role of the distribution system and on-site supply. And we're yet to do the true integrated system planning, which would look at the kind of optimal mix of those three levels: on-site, local, and bulk supply. So we've got a fair bit of work to do there. And I think it's probably a bit late to expect that to arrive in the next ISP, but hopefully by 2024, we'll get there. I guess the last point I would make is that, and I think Andrew's made it, so I'll be brief, is that we tend to think we know what the future is going to look like. It's going to be lots of wind, lots of solar, lots of storage, and it's just a matter of kind of filling in the blanks and getting the technical stuff right. But it's, we've seen with COVID that things can come out of nowhere and change everything pretty much overnight. And so I think it's really important to consider that what we think the future might look like is nothing like what it's going to be like. We know we might still want clean, affordable, resilient energy, but how that shapes up could be completely different. And we need structures and we need the mindset that will enable us to adapt, be flexible and nimble in the case of change. It's, being an environmentalist, I suppose for me, it's particularly around the impacts of climate change.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Mark. So I think the answer is that there's lots of answers. I mean, there is no, there is no single, there is no grand plan that anyone's going to come up with that's going to keep everyone happy and be digestible and stay relevant for any longer than 5 minutes. So I think what we've got to set up is this, I guess that the process needs to be a bit more organic. Like it can't be prescriptive. It needs to be local. It needs, and so I guess my perspective is that my own little social experiment is around trying to be on the ISP consumer panel, and I also chair the SA Power Networks customer panel. So we're working at the local level, my customer panel there on, trying to think through the transition, the high distributed energy customer owned future that's really obvious in South Australia. And at the same time, I'm participating in this planning and scenario work at the national level. And I've got to say, it is two parts of my brain can work pretty much independently and keep up with both of them. And that's challenging for me as a over 50s white bloke. But it's also not that helpful, I think, for consumers at large to be able to, you want confidence that this stuff is happening. I don't think the answer to this is making sure that everyone gets an invite to an AEMO webinar on planning. I think it is about us having confidence that this stuff is going on and that it's reflective of us as consumers and what we're thinking and what we're doing. There's a lot to it and it is really complicated, but the inevitable truth, and I think, and I'm going to say we're going to hit it here in South Australia because it's been a long time since we were first at everything, is that it's going to be something that we're going to need to deal with here because we're already at the point where system security is being challenged on those days of lots of sunshine and not much demand. So our sort of autumn and spring weekends, and we're starting to have to turn people's solar off, and it's little bit, well, we're doing it because we have to, a little bit of panic, not a lot of planning maybe, but there's a lot to be, it's the beginning of where it's going to go, right? So we're going to see more of this. Someone's going to have to be empowered to be able to do that. I guess this is the concept of the distribution system operator, or the DSO, as gets floated around the place. If they're going to be doing that, and I think David Haviott's pointed to this, you know, they need to be able to then, it'll inevitably, they're going to have to start providing some projections of demand back into to balance the system. In doing that, they're going to have to do a lot more rigorous planning and understanding, which is kind of have to be the local version of what the ISP is doing. And so you can see that it could work, but it's not about trying to take that one process and doing it and extending its reach. I think it's about replicating that process and having them meet somewhere in the middle. And hopefully there's enough almost competitive tension for the consumer dollar that we can have some arrangements there that would mean that we're not going to be spending both on transmission and also on distribution, as I think Muriel alluded to in the chat as well. That's my 2 cents worth. And also happy to talk about the death spiral, but should let Brian have a go.
Well, thanks, Andrew. I like that Mark described the ISP as transmission planner's Christmas list. Makes me wonder what is on his Christmas list. On my Christmas list is a picture of electricity infrastructure to have in the background, just like Andrew. I don't know how I can get poles and wires, but something to shoot for. And anyway, so I think there's a lot of great content there. I guess from my perspective, so I'm going to use another Eisenhower quote here, the wisdom of dead old white guys, which is planning is essential and plans are useless. So I think, I actually think the planning processes that I think that the history lesson from Andrew was well made. And the fact is the ISP, for all of its flaws, is better than anything that existed, 5 years ago. And even 2 years ago, this ISP will be better than the last one. But we can make it much better. And just as Andrew was discussing, we need to make it much more we need to do a much better job of local planning. I think there's an integration between those local plans or those distribution plans and the ISP, and they're not one and the same process. I mean, I think, something I was actually just speaking with someone else about this morning is it's kind of unbelievable in a world of Google Maps, the level of invisibility of the network, of the local distribution network to everyone. I mean, a remarkable thing, any one of us could go on right now, you could Google Southern California Edison distribution system map. Just Google it. You'll come up with you can actually go into Southern California and see what the distribution system is there and the amount of solar that system can host. We're way away from that still, all through Australia. And we're going to continue to be away from it until we get, put our shoulder down and just do the hard yards of actually gathering the data so that we can well articulate what's happening on the distribution system so that that system can best meet customer needs. So I guess one other thing I just wanted to throw out there is that I think there are planning frameworks for us to use that will work. I worry a bit more about the regulatory frameworks and whether or not those are fit for purpose. I think for forever, even the ISP is optimized planning, and so much of the regulatory framework is built around optimizing for least cost. The challenge in that framework is, what if customers invest in a system that meets what they perceive as their best value, but that doesn't necessarily reflect an overall least cost approach? And whether or not we can use the existing regulatory frameworks, or whether or not those are fit for purpose to actually promote the system that consumers are investing in. So I'll leave it there.
Do you want to make a comment on that?
Yeah, look, I think I'm going to go with it's not completely busted and we can get there from here. that would be my 2 cents worth in response to that, and also to Mark's Irish accent comments in his pre-recorded video. I reckon we can.
Okay. I'm just going to pick up a few things in the chat, which I think or in the Q&A, which I think we've sort of, some of which we've answered, but maybe I'd just like to draw out so people feel the things they're interested in are being thought of by each of you. So one of the questions, comments was really, I think, what Brian just went to, which is we really just don't have a lot of data or information on the low voltage network or distribution level. So that in itself is a real challenge. But I guess one of the things then too was, I think, inherent in some of the questions about forecasting, that we're sort of forecasting what we know, which is the bulk power supply system, and the feedback loops aren't exactly working between consumer-driven decisions. You might suggest some of those are driven by government policy, but some of them are driven really purely by consumers' own values, expectation and needs about why they want solar or why they want to electrify. It would be wrong to think that there's a one-to-one relationship between policy and consumer choices, although that does drive the mass market uptake. So I guess where I'm getting to is, one of the questions is, how are we going to get to this Goldilocks kind of landing where we haven't, I think Andrew, you referred to it, we haven't overbuilt the transmission network, we haven't, inherently built in some asset stranding. So some thoughts on that, I think, that people in the chat are really wanting to hear from you. So do you want to start with you, Andrew, and then maybe Mark and Brian? Sorry, and no pressure, because it's not an easy question.
No, and my immediate reaction was going to be, I think we should just all lower our expectations. Because, yeah, look, I don't think the Goldilocks answer is out there, I'm sorry. But we're going to get pretty close. I guess we just need to accept that there's lots of views out there, even in consumer land, I guess. And so we need to, and there are things like, the changes of, the prices of technologies, just what's available, what we end up doing with the electrification of transport, as Brian was alluding to. I mean, are we going to end up with us still all owning our own car, but it's electric? Or are we going to, is it more of a question, or are we going to be doing more ride sharing and sort of this transport as a service type future? All of this, and consumers will have a view on it, and I can give you an opinion that I feel today, and I reserve absolutely every right to change my mind whenever it suits me, when I either get more information or just because. And that's just the way it's going to be. So we need to have, I guess, this processes where we're understanding that, and we're incorporating that back into what we do. And I think this is where we need to be thinking about, just that local context. It just is such an important part of what we do. And I think we need to set aside this notion that we're going to have a single national solution. I think we have to accept that at best, we're going to end up with, how many dBs have we got, Lynn? 13?
13.
We might end up with 13 different local plans that feed into one national plan. I mean, we've got states are going and doing stuff that suits them, which is largely going to line up with the interests of consumers at large, but may not, but it'll be pretty close, I guess. We've just got to accept this stuff, the absence of a national type policy, I reckon we've got to use that as an advantage. And say, well, look, there's just no prospect of joining these dots up in that way. Let's do it our own way, which is we're just going to have these local stuff that will feed up into a national thing that will provide some oversight and some checks and balances and stop people going completely off the reservation. But yeah, I'm afraid that's the sum of my experience of the last 20 years is, lower your expectations and they'll probably be met. It's not really that positive, is it? Sorry.
Oh, no, I think we've got to be pragmatic as well. Do you mean, I'd like to change the language. I'll go to you, Mark, in a minute. I'd like to change the language, because we talk about forecasting as if things can be forecast. And as a former modeler, forecasting is when the past can tell you something about the future. We're not in that kind of world. The 20th century can tell us something maybe, about the 21st century, you know, energy system. But we're really in a world of uncertainty, and
we have to embrace that. You know,
exactly,
that is our reality. So, given that, you know, and really, I guess this is where I was pointing to this electrification of everything. I mean, one of the things that is at the early stages of the model, maybe there's 2 points I should make. So what we've been told about the modelling so far for this next version of the ISP is it's not going to recommend a lot more transmission build, right? Other than what's happening within the states around reses and so on. So the idea of more interconnection and that sort of stuff is probably not going to emerge. So it could be that things like Project Energy Connect become just this, you know, it's a really large, chunky investment, but we're also running the risk of working out how to do that better for a circumstance that will probably never arise again, because we're never going to be able to demonstrate a need for such a massive investment in the market. So I'll go with that. There was probably something else, but I've forgotten.
That's all right. Mark, do you want to jump in?
I've just been wondering about the implications of a more localized system for the need for greater energy literacy. And there are people on the call who are better placed to get into that than me, but it is problematic unless you want to put your faith in automation and aggregation, which not everyone does. Then there's a need for people to be more informed about the choices they make, and that's not easy to do. One of the things I think, as I mentioned in my recorded talk, that would make a big difference to local resilience is if solar and battery systems are islandable, at least for a few hours. And I think the majority of the solar owners who have, you know, when they buy up, they think they're getting a system which will operate off grid, and they don't. And I think, you know, just to have that kind of information seems really basic, but it's not there. Even with solar, which is pretty easy, when it comes to batteries, you're kind of looking at a whole magnitude of complexity. I ran a bunch of workshops around New South Wales a few years ago at the end of the feed-in tariff about people's options, and we had about 100 times 20 something workshops. Most people came along wanting a battery. By the time we explained how batteries worked and integrated with solar and, you know, the whole system, almost nobody wanted a battery because it was too hard, and it's very hard for installers to sell them on that basis too. So I think we've got a real challenge there about how to kind of give people more autonomy and control, but also not overwhelm them with information. And Mallacoota is another good example. You know, your work there showed with the battery there that people just didn't understand and weren't well informed about what the battery could and couldn't do, because it didn't save their bacon and won't.
Yeah, and I guess we're used to a sort of, you know, set and forget 20th century electricity system, which is, you know, wide reliability or, you know, outages, and, you know, have really made it much more complex now for consumers to understand and engage with. So Brian, do you want to jump in on some of those points as well?
Sure, yeah. I mean, so I think there's an interesting, a bunch of interesting different thoughts I had. So, or whether or not the thoughts are interesting is debatable, but reflections on interesting thoughts from others. So one is this, the change that's happening in utility. Like, we've been talking all of this time about planning, but you know, there's a broader evolution of the utility industry and really the network industry, where it's moving from traditionally being a planning organization to an operational organization. And so I think some of what you know, we mentioned before about the need for greater data, not only does it allow planning to be much more effective, it also forms the basis by which you can be much more dynamic in the way you operate the grid. And so you don't just have to plan for the one and, you know, the one in every 5-year event. You can operate the system much more efficiently so that we really get a much greater utilization of the existing infrastructure. So I think there's a, and then I guess another thing that the discussion sparked in me was just, I think in general, there is no doubt that there's a need for a certain amount of new transmission, but in general, I've become increasingly wary of big infrastructure projects. And I think that's one of the advantages of small scale resources is really that is their modularity and optionality. And so when historically we had to plan 5 years in the future. Things like the ISP are basically 5-year investment plans because it took that long, took even longer sometimes for a big coal or gas plant to get sited, permitted, engineered, and built. It was this huge bespoke engineering job. But it's not the way power plants are built anymore. They're all modular. A big storage facility can go up in under a year. And so and you can add to it later if you need to. So I do think that there's the ability for us to be much more flexible going forward. And frankly, that's what is called for, because as these guys pointed out much better than I did. I was sort of deterministic in my, it's like, electric vehicles, which I do believe, but exactly how those electric vehicles sort of propagate themselves through the grid is anybody's guess. And we need to maintain a high degree of flexibility to allow us to integrate those in lower cost way. We're never going to achieve the least cost way, but lower cost ways.
Okay. One of the questions that's come up in the chat, and a number of people are interested in, I'm going to ask it in a particular way, which is, I guess, what we did in the 20th century is, to pick up on your point just then, Brian, about modular and versus large. Scale was our friend in the 20th century as we brought electricity to the nation and everywhere. And in another context, people might refer to that as, socializing the costs of a sort of shared asset, a shared enterprise. But in the kind of world in which consumers have own assets, and in Mark's more democratic system, what do each of you think about the need to have a conversation about, or how do we improve consumers' understanding about how the costs of this new system are then recovered? What costs are shared? What costs are user pays? The economists might tend to think, well, it's all user pays, but we've never done electricity that way. And nor do I think you can do an essential service that way. So it really becomes, what's the place of sort of user pays and what's the place of sort of shared costs? So I wonder whether there's some thoughts that you had on that. Maybe we'll start with you, Andrew, and then Mark, and maybe Brian.
Yeah, look, I guess having been involved in the tariff reform stuff in the NEM for a while, again, lower your expectations and you'll do all right. So I think there's some real limitations there. And the concept of sharing and just how much we're prepared to share is a really important one for consumers to grapple amongst themselves, But one of the things that is also very clear that is in the consumer interest, no matter how you slice it and dice it, better utilisation of the fixed infrastructure, i.e. the networks, leads to lower prices in terms of the volume of energy and therefore the general life and happiness that we all enjoy. It'll keep downward pressure on those prices. So I guess this is something where I think we need to, it's almost a cultural thing, I guess. It's something that's been relayed to me around in the South Australian context, is that there's really good feed-in tariffs, which kicked off the whole solar revolution and all the rest of it, has also created a sense of entitlement that folks expect that, I'm producing electricity and you should pay me for it. And if you don't, then you're an evil bugger. And that's, only partly true. Part of it is also the fact that our success with solar means that we've got lots of it and we don't have things that we're going to do with it so well. And that's where, I guess, where Brian was getting to earlier. So look, I think it's more of that. I think folks would be better off and probably have more success if we focus on that sort of that bit where we're balancing and utilising the network a bit better, rather than necessarily targeting individual consumers. Because I've got to say, if you open up the door or the box of cost reflective pricing, one of the first, and I hate to say it, but cross subsidies that will need to be tackled is locational pricing. It is those of us in the highly dense city that share infrastructure versus those of us that don't live in the cities and that there isn't so much sharing. And I'm not sure that's a path that's a particularly useful one to go down in terms of this, the local energy stuff. And that's a real conundrum. There's no doubt about it. And that's something that we're going to have to face going forward. But that's where, understanding consumers' appetite, not so much for solar panels and batteries, but their appetite for sharing would be something that I think is going to unfold over the next little while. It will become more local. That's inevitable. It will become more obvious just how much people are prepared to share, and we just need to be tuned into that. And I think, as we've probably canvassed a bit, but can never say it too often, we've got to keep things simple so that the non-experts can engage in these discussions. It is so easy to drift off into language that leaves people out of it. I think we've done a good job today, but it's just always a challenge. And wherever we go in this space, we've got to bring as many people as possible along. So they need to be informed and in a way that helps them understand what's really at stake here, and not so much get caught up in some of the jargon and lingo. So big challenge. But again, I think we can get there from here.
Mark.
It's really impressed me the extent of what appears to be altruism amongst consumers when they're informed about what the kind of cross subsidies are, for rural and remote customers. There can be 20 times the cost to serve compared to city consumers, and yet people are still prepared to do that to support other Australians, and I think that's really quite impressive. And we haggle about very small amounts of money in the DER space, and I remember the kind of forensic accounting that Sapin was subjected to with the last reg proposal around its LV enablement business case, and compare that to the $27 billion of spending that's earmarked for transmission in the last ISP, and think, we've really kind of got a sense of an odd sense of proportion here. So I don't really know how to overcome that when we kind of haven't got our heads around this sort of what I call the paradigm shift from top down to bottom up thinking. I think our mindset, the change in our mindset is taking a much longer time to translate into governance and regulatory reform than the economics and the technology. We're really kind of behind the 8 ball, and we can only use forums like this to sort of turn that around as fast as possible, I hope.
So I liked a lot of what Andrew said about just about this topic. I mean, I think one of the interesting things in the standalone power system rulemaking was some really great analysis by AMC about the amount of cost shifting that occurs between urban and urban customers pay for rural networks, and it's always been that way. In general, a cost shift that we don't talk a lot about is efficiency, to the extent that there are efficiency incentives, which is more common in North America, but those are paid for by all customers, and well-informed, educated customers reap the benefits significantly more than less informed customers. And so I don't know that I don't know there's a good conversation to be had here. I think it's a tough conversation no matter how you slice it or dice it. And so I think there's probably there's a couple things I think about. One is we do have to understand how best to have the conversation, because it's difficult for me to imagine a way in which there's always going to be kind of the last customer in. And so at a certain point, there's going to be a threshold decision for someone to build more infrastructure, and how that is paid for is likely to end up on whoever comes in last. Maybe it shouldn't be that way and we can mitigate some of that, but there's always going to be an element of fixed infrastructure that already exists, can accommodate a certain amount of any given resource, and first and best dressed. And after you get past that, the conversation gets harder. I think to build on what Mark said, which I agree with, that people are much more altruistic than we give them credit for. A really important way to have that conversation is making sure there are opportunities for everybody to participate. So as Andrew said, making better use of the existing infrastructures, it really ought to be job one in all of this, and finding ways in which, people like me, and I rent and I live in a flat, like how best can I participate and use the inherent flexibility in my energy devices to support a better grid and a better utilized shared infrastructure for everyone.
Okay, I'm going to change the tack slightly, and let's see how you'll go with thinking about this. One of the questions that's come up in the chat as well is something that comes up a lot, I think, in the conversations each of us all have in different places. But the question goes to, if you like, the dominance of thinking of engineering and economics when we're wanting to understand the consumer perspective. Like, how do we bring different ways of thinking about consumers, different disciplines? I know it's something we think a lot about at ECA. We're using different methodologies. Many of you have heard us talk about social practice. We think about behavioural insights. We think about ethnography, anthropology. So it's really different ways of framing the discussion, I guess, with consumers, whereas we've tended to have a dominance of the engineering framing or the economics framing. So maybe, Brian, I'll start with you and go round. Just really thoughts, I guess. I think there's no easy answer to that question either, but I think if we continue to think what we're trying to do is socialise people into learning to be better economists, or consumers into be better economists, or consumers to be better engineers, we're not going to navigate this transition.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Lynn. So I'll use another Amory quote, or a Amory quote, which is, people don't want electricity, they want hot showers and cold beers. And I said that once in Papua New Guinea, was accused of gender stereotyping electricity use. So I appreciate that people might want electricity for other things. I like cold beer. But I think
hair dries.
Exactly. I think so. I really do think that there, and you and I talked about this last week at one point, Lynn. I think the surveying work that ECA does is great and important, but it's probably not sufficient. Like, there are, anthropological ways or design thinking ways of having interviews with customers that are wide ranging, and just talk to an average bloke about how they use energy and what they want to do with it, that allows designers and engineers and all sorts of other product developers to think about building on top of that. I mean, I think one of the challenges in all of this, I mean, we spend so much time abstracted from the problem. We are thinking about it in these frameworks and all of that. But to abstract this problem again, I think one of the issues, one of the questions I have about this is, arguably that's what retailers ought to be doing now. And no doubt some of them are. But probably, retail, the true competition and diversity of retail offerings is less than anyone would hope for. So how can we make sure that that happens without sort of doing their job for them? And anyway.
Yeah, that's a good point. Mark?
As a regulatory geek, I'd say it kind of starts with the rules or the law. And, I mean, we kind of complain about the NEO till the cows come home, but the National Electricity Objective and Gas Objective is the efficient investment and operation of the market in the long-term interest of consumers. But that long-term interest of consumers is defined in economic and technical terms, not in terms of other consumer outcomes. Changing from the top down would be a good idea, and I know that's not going to happen anytime soon. So changing the regulations from the bottom up, or from the implementation around particular reforms, is also a good thing. And with the DR export access and pricing rule change, long-winded way of saying the solar tax, we did get some pretty good consumer protections in there by the end of the process. And I've, as you know, proposed a rule change which hasn't gone to the AMC around resilience, but that would require networks not just to factor in resilience alongside reliability and price in their investment planning, but would require them to work with local communities in high-risk areas to prepare local energy resilience plans. So it gives the community kind of guaranteed, once an area is identified as being high risk of losing supply for a long period as a result of severe weather events, then potentially even the community could initiate one of those processes of a dialogue with the network. Whereas at the moment, around the whole electricity system, individuals and communities have very few rights. They're kind of really at the behest of the networks and retailers and generators for the most part. But give them a seat at the table in the rules, basically.
Okay.
And I should also say that in the 10 years that I've been doing this job, networks have got a hell of a lot better at this process. They were terrible 10 years ago. They got a bit better 5 years ago, and now they're getting pretty good. So, there's a lot of learning going on. And I get really impressed when I see things like, what's the term, participatory democracy or?
Deliberative forums.
Deliberative, yeah. Sapin did some 5 years ago for their reg proposal, and the amount that people learned and were able to understand and feed back within 2 days of being part of this process was just extraordinary. It was like dealing with people who'd been in my job for 5 years. It was quite intimidating, the kind of understanding and insight that they had. So you give people the right tools and they can really be very useful to planning the system.
Yes, I would agree. But I'm going to try not to agree because I think we've been agreeing on too much stuff. So
I don't agree.
I thought you were going to say that. So I guess I don't. I think we can work a lot more within the limitations of the framework. And Mark's called out some good examples there. So I'm going to agree with him, but just token disagreement for the sake of it. The framework already allows for jurisdictional obligations to be incorporated into what you do, and they don't have to be economically rational or anything. They can just be the state said we've got to do this. So feed-in tariffs are a great example. They're generally incorporated in distribution level resets through those sort of mechanisms. And I imagine that we could do the same sort of thing. I have had some, with SA Power Networks, we've had some good success in that one that Mark was talking about, deliberative democracy, but it was about tariffs. And it was logical that tariffs is about, so we've agreed on the squillions of dollars that the business can get. So how do we divvy it up amongst the customers and who's going to pay for it? Well, that's got to be customers deciding it for themselves, surely, rather than having the business do it. So great example, and we'll do it again in the reset coming up. I think the other small example from the last SA Power Networks reset that those of us that were involved were quite proud of, even though it was small. And it was around, I guess, an issue of equity and the worst served. And the regulator knocked back a proposal from SA Power Networks to improve the reliability of the worst served, spend some money on lightning protection in areas that, were getting worse, even though they couldn't demonstrate that in the average performance of unserved energy as the performance regulatory metrics are. As a panel, we put in a very strong submission to say, no, actually, as customers, we believe that this is more of an issue of equity and that we believe that it's worth supporting. And the regulator said, okay, then. It was only small in the grand scheme of things, but it was an example of where we could inject some values in there that weren't purely that that sort of rational economics. And so I think this more local approach has plenty of room for that. And I notice there's a comment in some of the questions around, is it customer and consumer? One of the other comments I guess we've been getting recently in our discussions about the next reset at SA Power Networks is around community as the next C. And to what extent do we want to see community aspirations and community expectations injected into the process? Like it's not impossible at all. And again, local context for local issues, local opportunities, that's where it's got to come in. I can't see it. There's no way we could have these conversations with the likes of an AENO, for example, who are dealing with, such a large and diverse range of issues at that end. It's just not conceivable that we can have too many humans that are able to understand what's happening at the local level and, all of the intricacies of a power system. Again, if we set our expectations about right in terms of what folks can manage, then we've got a better chance of success.
Okay, that's great. Look, we've got about 10 more minutes, so I guess maybe it's an opportunity to sort of reflect, I guess, on the conversation over the last hour or so that we've had. We started with a sort of call to action around the key theme of this webinar, which was sort of system design and planning. And the call to action really is not just for the panelists, but for everybody participating in this session to think about how we better have it. We often talk about consumer centric, which is particular words I don't actually find compelling, but how do we bring consumers' values, their expectations, their needs? And I think we've just heard you say a little bit about that, Andrew, as well. How do we really put that at the start of it, at the beginning of it, not at the end of the sort of process? So I guess maybe I'll go to each of you. If you wanted to pick out something, I think that has struck you in this conversation, that you think that you'll carry away as something that really you think is something that needs to be embedded in how you do your work or how we all go about doing our own respective work. What might one of those observations or reflections be? So, Mark, how about I start with you?
How about you don't?
How about I don't?
Struggling to think about it at the moment. Come back to me, please.
Okay. Yeah. Andrew's ready to go.
When I started doing a bit of this stuff a year or so ago, I was really challenged by the concept of scenarios, and I find it difficult, just in terms of the way that I think, to really put myself, 10 years into the future or 20 years into the future and try and imagine, the natural progression of things like, smartphones and Internet of Things and that. I'm not a futurist. I don't think there's that many really good futurists out there. And I wondered, and so I struggle with that a bit. I've now landed, and I've had some good conversations with folks over the last little while, that the scenario work is actually a really good entry point for folks to engage on this whole stuff. And is it, do we want to do a bit more work on just a vision of the future, like postcards from the future, different people, different consumers in 2030 or 2035 or whatever, that are sending us back a little YouTube or whatever it is that young people watch, and of life. This is what I'm doing. I'm Brian. I'm still renting my apartment in Newcastle, but I get virtually free electricity during the day because there's so much going on, or I've really struggled to be able to charge my car because there's no car park there, whatever. But you could look at, try and imagine all of these different circumstances that people are in. And as I said, I find it really hard to just vision that. I need help, and I need help from people that are creative and clever about telling stories. I want to see some stories from the future. I reckon I can do a good job of advocating for those interests, but I'm not sure I really understand what they are. So that to me would be a really helpful contribution. And then folks can maybe start to identify a little bit with their aspirations, a bit about what might be possible. And, you know, do they really want to have control? Is it going to, are they set and forget type people? Are they, leave it to me, I'm going to manage this market myself by my phone? You know, there's all sorts out there. I think for a lot of folks, it's just hard to conceive. And for a lot of folks, it's not about energy at all. It is about what life am I going to be leading, and then working back from that, what might that mean? All of that is useful for us trying to make a difference today.
Great point. Mark, you're next.
I agree with everything Andrew said. I don't have anything to add at the moment. Thanks.
Okay. Brian, last chance to wrap up.
I disagree vehemently with Andrew. No, as much as he would like me to, I don't. But I'll take a completely different tactic, actually. So, I agree that scenario, like, yeah, I think scenarios are a good place for people to enter the system. But it was actually something that I think Mark has a lot of experience in, and Andrew referenced, which is, I think there's a lot that we could learn from lived examples in local communities. So I actually think, and Arena's got a bunch of funding and Race and everybody else, you know, like actually promoting, like, let's try some of this out in community context, pick a community or have that community come forward, you know, some way of identifying a place where we can do alternative and arguably what we, you know, what some of the, you know, people like Mark and Andrew see as best case planning approaches for a local community, and see and try it out, so we start to understand all the friction points. So I do think there's a lot of, so I think for me that was one of the interesting things that came out of this, is that I do think there's an importance in being more thoughtful and holistic and systematic and abstract about the whole all this nonsense, but let's also practice some of what we're preaching and actually, you know, try and implement this on a small scale.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, which essentially goes to, you know, the diversity of experience, and, you know, Andrew's point as well about the future, and also Mark's point about the future is local. And maybe if I, you know, punctuated with, you know, Mark's last slide, which is, you know, think local, do no harm, and listen to people. So I think that's probably where we've landed. Look, I need to wrap it up, and it's been a great conversation. There's also almost a conversation that has its own momentum going on in the chat. So just so people know that we will also capture that in our feedback and sharing that with people, because it is very valuable. I'm really glad to see that the conversation and the participation from our panelists stimulated quite a healthy discussion as well between people. So I'd just like to thank all our panelists, Brian for sort of being both MC and panelist, given that he's only been a week at ECA. I think it was very much appreciated that he was happy to sort of do the dual role today, but also thanks to Andrew for bringing your valuable perspectives from particularly from the ISP consumer panel and the work you've been doing there, as well as the work you're doing in South Australia. And Mark, as always, who has been a tireless advocate for a different consumer sort of centred community designed energy system. So we'll end there. This is the last in our series, as I said earlier, and we're currently planning what our Foresighting Forum 2022 will look like. Sad to say, I think even though we may have vaccine passports soon, we're not anticipating that we'd be able to have it in the usual time frame in the usual way. So what we plan to do is kick off a series of webinars starting at around the same time we would normally have. Most of you, I hope, have still got save the date in February. I think it's the 15th and 16th, so it'll be sometime around then. But what we might do is continue to have these kinds of forums online until such time as, with a bit of confidence, we can have an open and inclusive kind of event that we normally have, which brings people together from around Australia and across the sector to have conversations about the real opportunities as well as some of the wicked problems we're all trying to resolve. So thanks everybody, and stay safe, and thanks again.